We are going to talk about the life of Lucretia Mott, a suffragist and an abolitionist equal to both passions. And we have today, if we think about it, Lucretia Mott is sometimes the least acknowledged of the suffrage heroes. And so Jamie Stiehm is going to discuss American political history's, shall we say, one of the best kept secrets, the Philadelphia Quaker Lucretia Mott. She lived on the front lines of two great 19th century human rights movements to free enslaved people and to bring women fully into the decision-making process of this country. The American Anti-Slavery Society was founded in 1833 in her living room. Her fame came from her radiant speaking voice. Multitudes of people came to hear Lucretia Mott as she spoke across the northern states from Boston to Ohio. Frederick Douglass praised her as bearing a message of light and love. In 1843, John Quincy Adams invited her to speak to Southern slaveholders in Congress. In 1848, Mott was the main speaker and the founder of the women's rights movement in Seneca Falls, New York. A major figure, Lucretia Mott is one of the three women portrayed in the United States Capitol Rotunda sculpture, the Suffrage Monument. And we will hear about that statue and its story from our speaker today. Jamie is a syndicated columnist, an author, and a historian. This is her second time joining us, and we are grateful to have you back. The last time we were speaking about the book that you had recently published called The War Within, a first-person account of the January 6th attack on the Capitol. Essays on democracy as precious and fragile, and yet fragile, are concluded in that collection and in all of her work. Jamie has worked as a city desk reporter at the Baltimore Sun, a staff writer on the Hill newspaper, assignment editor and CBS News London. She studied at Swarthmore College, which we will learn about. One of the founders was Lucretia Mott. She is engaged now in writing a biography of Mott, so we get to have an early insight into her research. She now covers national politics and history in her Creators Syndicate column. Her work, along with her public talks, may be found at jamiestiehm.com, and you'll get that information in the follow-up so that you can follow her. That being said, Jamie, walk us into history. Tell us about Lucretia Mott, and then we will have a wonderful Q&A session. So if you got any questions, put them in the Q&A, and as soon as Jamie's done, we're going to have a robust conversation. Thank you, and thank you, Jamie.
Jane, that's a wonderful invitation and introduction, and I'm very happy to be here. She is more relevant and imperative than ever in our public life. So as a girl growing up, little Lucretia Coffin was a sprightly island girl. Nantucket was her oyster. To roam free around the wharves, Main Street, the cranberry bogs, the sheep shearing festival. And Nantucket, as many know, was the whaling capital, but it was also a Quaker community. In 1800, when Lucretia was 7 years old. To give you some historical perspective, George Washington was president the day she was born, and Lucretia outlived Lincoln. So her father, Thomas Coffin, was a sea captain. Most men and boys on Nantucket were on long sea voyages. They went to sea for 2 or 3 years at a time. So the women were in charge of running the island. foggy, faraway Nantucket. And they could not be helpless, delicate beings. No, Nantucket women were famously self-reliant and sturdy. They took care of children, animals, the sick, the whole community. And so Lucretia went to the Quaker school and meetings for worship, and she was predisposed to be strong and to speak her mind. The Society of Friends, or Quakers, were the air that Lucretia breathed. She was a birthright Quaker from one of the founding families of Nantucket. Quakers were the first religion to actively oppose slavery. As a girl living in a mariner's world, she learned about the evils of the Middle Passage, the transatlantic slave trade. So there you have the origins of one of America's greatest abolitionists. Yet her Quaker faith in universal human rights shaped her like the Crescent Island to become the first to stand and speak for the rights of women. In fact, Lucretia Mott, as Jane said, founded the American Women's Rights Movement and was the main speaker at Seneca Falls in 1848. That was a revolutionary year. Mott was a Quaker revolutionary whose gift was her voice, a radiant, mesmerizing voice of moral urgency in the moment, speaking without a text in the Quaker manner. So she moved multitudes all over the land from Boston, her home city of Philadelphia, and Ohio, which was a very strong abolitionist state. And she came to Washington, here, the city, in 1843. Amazingly, old man eloquent, John Quincy Adams, invited her to address and talk some sense into the Southern slave owner colleagues he had in the House. For the stern Puritan to do so is a mark of enormous respect for her powers and shows a willingness to break convention. For a woman to address Congress, good heavens. This is antebellum America. Quincy Adams believed Lucretia Mott could do better than he had in moving the rock of slavery. And he knew, like many travelers between Boston and Washington, that the Mott House was like a large lighthouse for fugitive slaves, and it was an anti-slavery salon. Their dining room could seat 50 places. In fact, the American Anti-Slavery Society was founded in that living room in 1833, when Lucretia was 40 years old and a mother of 5. I'll return to Lucretia's 1843 visit to Washington, but there's so much more to know about this bright, shining beacon for justice. Her life work is inseparable from her Quaker faith, but don't be fooled by the bonnet. Lucretia Mott was tart, not sweet, and she considered us a guilty nation. A guilty nation. Speaking in Black community churches and starting a mixed race female anti-slavery society, Lucretia attracted the attention of a Southern white supremacist mob that almost burned her house down. She and James and their son Thomas were waiting for the mob at midnight by the hearth, but they were misdirected by a Quaker poet named John Greenleaf Whittier. The 1830s, understand that the 1830s were perhaps the most benighted time to be alive in America. Lucretia was becoming famous. By 1840, she was on her way to international fame. With James, William Lloyd Garrison, and other delegates, she journeyed to London to the World Anti-Slavery Convention, only to be excluded because of her sex. The stuffy British organizers, including Thomas Clarkson, were very rude, but the press crowned her the Lioness of London. She received speaking invitations all over the British Isles. Lady Byron, the poet's widow, Thomas Carlyle, and the Irish Catholic emancipator Daniel O'Connell all wanted to hang out with her. And on a call to Philadelphia in 1842, author Charles Dickens made sure to pay his respects to the worthy Mrs. Mott. This is what she had: moral charisma. It's hard to reproduce, but you have to use your historical imagination to understand Lucretia Mott. Nobody paid her, nobody elected her to lead the way for emancipating the enslaved and women. She wasn't even a citizen of this country. She was well off. She could have been a lady of leisure. But to Lucretia, these were one and the same causes, as Jane indicated, or like brother and sister movements, intertwined. This sprang from Quaker and Enlightenment beliefs, mixed with being in this nation's first generation, imbued with its stated ideals. Few saw it this way, but Frederick Douglass shared her double vision, and he left the best living portrait of Lucretia Mott in his memoir. Quote, "The very sight of her, a sermon, bearing a message of light and love. I will never forget the first time I heard Lucretia Mott speak. I've never failed to be uplifted by her message. Through their many years together as allies and friends, he was at Seneca Falls. He was a women's rights man." So here's something else Lucretia and her friend Douglass had in common. As total outsiders to the power structure, they each had tremendous presence and voices under the sky, in assembly halls. They were heard. And the voice is one thing they can't take away from you. A few words about the Quaker position on the Civil War. As pacifists, they were torn because they had moved the public mind on slavery for 30 years to the brink of the Emancipation Proclamation. Lucretia was the great practitioner of moral suasion, the Quaker method of social change, but she recognized the wealthy Southern slave power would not surrender without bloodshed and secession. She was fine with secession. Further, she worried that the new president, Abraham Lincoln, was a, quote, miserable compromiser. That's how staunch she was. In fact, Lincoln did propose to leave slavery alone in his first inaugural address, as long as it did not expand. Lincoln and Lucretia never met, which is a shame, but Douglass knew both of them. And I think of those three as the trifecta of freedom in the 19th century. So Lucretia later changed her mind about Lincoln, and Lincoln knew he could not have signed that document, freeing 4 million enslaved people, without the Society of Friends and their nonviolent resistance to the laws of the land. Mott's sojourn to Washington, with James by her side always, was not all peaches and cream. First of all, the capital was a Southern city with slave markets and Southerners controlling Congress and the White House. Quincy Adams had a lonely battle on his hands as the first fierce opponent of slavery in Congress. Now, you may know the date set for Lucretia's address, January 30th, 1843, was during the gag rule, meaning slavery could not be discussed on the House floor for years. So her speech or sermon was moved to the First Unitarian Church. Ralph Waldo Emerson was there, and Quakers and Unitarians were very kindred spirits then and now. All the pews were packed. Members of Congress came out on a cold winter night to hear the Quaker lady speak. Tiny Quaker lady, all of 5 feet tall. And for that one night, Lucretia Mott lifted her voice, quoted the prophet Isaiah, and melted the sectional divide. A remarkable event, which was splashed across the newspapers the next morning. Emerson wrote home to Concord, "The flower of Quakerism." The First Unitarian Church still has the program in its archives. I gave a talk there about her talk there. From a long solo address, probably an hour or so, I've chosen this passage. Quote, "O ye statesmen, if such be present, fear not to speak aloud. The only remedy is to break the bonds and let the oppressed go free." Now for 2 pieces of art in conclusion. This portrait of Lucretia at about the time of her congressional address was painted when she was about 50. She lived to be 87. I fell under her gaze at Swarthmore College. This portrait was in the parlor, and I was a sophomore. Swarthmore, I was completely under her spell. I needed to know who she was. And that wise countenance seemed to speak out of the silence. Sorry. You see, I take it with me everywhere. Yes, she seemed to speak out of the silence. And because she was a speaker, she's been somewhat lost in translation. She was a speaker, not a writer. And writers tend to last longer in the annals of history. So, as most of you know, there's a suffrage monument in the US Capitol Rotunda. And Mott is depicted there along with Susan B. Anthony, also a Quaker, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She was the foremother of the 3. She mentored the other 2 who were much younger. She inspired them. They would not have become who they were without her. And it is my mission. My mission is to kind of reinvigorate her legacy, her reputation, to invite you to enter into her world. Her world was the age of the spoken word. That's why her influence was so wide. She took her Quaker talents for speaking and she moved to the public square. The Society of Friends recognized she had a rare distinction. So if my book project goes well, it's called Leading Light. I'm lucky to have an excellent agent in New York who's shopping it around. But back to the suffrage monument, which languished in the Capitol crypt for 70 years. It was a gift to Congress from the artist. after women won the right to vote in the 1920. So in the 20s to the 90s, there it was in the Capitol crypt. Finally, it was elevated in 1998. Roger Williams of Rhode Island had to be moved out so they could be moved in. And I was there that day. I remember Connie Morella speaking to the statue saying, "Welcome home, ladies." And of these three, Lucretia Coffin Mott was the greatest of them all. I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you so much. So can you tell us, why do you think at this point in history, Lucretia Mott has been so overshadowed by Susan B. Anthony, who's on the quarter, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who is much, much better known? What's the story about that?
Well, Elizabeth Cady Stanton was a writer. She was a judge's daughter, and she knew the legal language, and she borrowed from Thomas Jefferson for the Declaration. She was more, she was not as much of a speaker. She was a writer, and Susan B. Anthony was the organizer. So I think of Lucretia was the voice, Stanton was the pen, and Susan B. Anthony was the organizer. And those two, the later two, lived into the 20th century. So they were more modern figures. There was more, say, mass media at the time. And, we have a few pictures of Lucretia Mott, but we don't have a recording of her voice, which is a shame, because if we did, I think her reputation and legacy, that she would be as famous now as she was then.
So what was the sort of most surprising thing that you found as you started down this research path?
Well, funny you should ask, because I recently discovered that Lucretia Mott was in league with Aaron Burr's son. Yeah. Aaron Burr had a son with his Indian housekeeper, women of color, and this man was a barber in Philadelphia, very active on the Underground Railroad. So a barber by day, Underground Railroad conductor by night. And his wife, Hetty Burr, his name was Jean-Pierre Burr. Hetty Burr was in Lucretia's anti-slavery society, female anti-slavery society. And Jean-Pierre Burr would often bring runaway slaves to the Mott house. I don't know if she knew that that was Aaron Burr's son, but she probably did. She knew everybody, and everybody knew Mrs. Mott. She was like Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt was probably the closest historical parallel I can give you.
One of our listeners has asked, they want to know a little bit more of the story about the suffrage statue. Why did it linger in the crypt? When did it come into the when did it come to the Capitol, and what's the backstory there?
Well, Jane, you probably know as well as I do. It was a gift to Congress from the sculptor, Adelaide Johnson. And so she gave it to celebrate women's suffrage in the 20s. And Congress at that time was not too thrilled to, celebrate women's suffrage. They probably only had one woman in Congress, and that was Jeanette Rankin. So it just stood there, or sat there in the crypt. And it doesn't even receive much attention now, but it had virtually no attention in the crypt until the money was privately raised to elevate it into the rotunda. This is the inner sanctum of democracy. The story of America is told there in the murals and statues and presidential likenesses, the battles. These are the only 3 American women who are portrayed in the rotunda. So it was a monumental moment, and there were a chorus of schoolgirls sang when finally this statue was put in its proper place. And I do notice as people pass, they don't know the story of the statue. They don't know who these women are. And so I kind of make it my my task to tell them about the statue, especially about the woman in the bonnet.
So it came to the Capitol even before the passage of the 19th Amendment?
No, after.
It came after, right?
Yeah, the
Came
19th
soon
Amendment was 1920. Alice Paul led the way. She was also a Quaker. And so a few years after that, Adelaide Johnson finished the statue, and she left like a blank space to symbolize unfinished work. The journey is not over. Does that answer the question?
No, I think that is the story, but it's an interesting that it came in 1921,
Okay.
right after not long after the passage of the 19th Amendment. And it was actually this unveiling ceremony was held on Susan B. Anthony's birthday.
Thank you. That's good to know. In February.
1921, February 15th. But it took yet another round of effort to get it moved into the rotunda. So
the artist must have been working on it before the amendment. She must have had a sense that this day was coming.
Yeah, I mean, the presentation by the artist at the time said, that this represented 72 years of effort to get to the point to pass the suffrage amendment.
So that's counting from Seneca Falls, 1848.
Yeah.
And interestingly, 1776 to 1848, I think that's also 72 years. So it's that year in history, and also in Europe, that was a year of tremendous loosening up and challenging orthodoxy and revolutions. This was a peaceful revolution, but a revolution nonetheless.
So now in any work for justice, work for expansion of rights and opportunities, there's resistance. What kind of resistance did Lucretia Mott face, both from within the women's suffrage community and outside?
And she was the undisputed leader of the women's suffrage community. Everyone loved her. But some of her fellow Quakers, the conservative branch of the Friends, thought that she was too radical and that she was moving too fast on challenging slavery. She didn't just have her principles and beliefs, she acted upon them. And so she was sometimes denounced by the mainline Quakers in Philadelphia. And when she traveled, the more conservative Friends found her to be, what's the word I want? She was unwavering, and she refused to backtrack or to soften her message. And she belonged to the Hicksite branch of the Quakers, which boycotted slave products and petitioned Congress and were much more in the struggle. The mainline Quakers were more like, oh, we oppose slavery, but it'll come, the end will come one day. I'm paraphrasing, obviously.
Right. Obviously. But, if you think about this, there also was a lot of strife internally in the women's community, where Elizabeth Cady Stanton and some others felt that it would be wise to, in the pursuit for votes for women, to say, well, if women had the right to vote, they would be able to outvote the African American men, and it was like, no,
And
that was
that's
not
not quite,
something.
this is what Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott believed it too, that they had worked for the citizenship and for the emancipation of enslaved people, and they thought that they were going to be on the same train.
Mhm.
That train only comes once or twice in a century. And so they believed that there was just cause, that they too would become citizens at the end of the Civil War in the political settlement. Lucretia Mott was not as militant about that as Elizabeth Cady Stanton was, and Susan B. Anthony, but she was disappointed too. She was the president of the American Equal Rights Association, and they took that stand. There were some racist remarks by Stanton that Lucretia Mott denounced, but they were not saying that they could outvote African American men. That was what they were saying, is that we deserve, we worked, it's our time too. And as it happened, they had to work another 50 years for suffrage. So they missed that train. And they knew they might not live to see women vote. Not one of the 3 women in that statue ever voted.
Lived to see it happen.
Right.
So but there was tension within the women's movement about how, things like when there was a parade for suffrage, would African American women be able to be at the front of the
Yeah,
parade?
I can speak to that. I know I interviewed Speaker Pelosi about that. I'm actually an expert on Alice Paul, who organized that parade. And she went to Swarthmore, class of 1905. She had to negotiate with the police chief of Washington, D.C., to get permission for that parade. It was the first march on Washington ever. This was a Southern Jim Crow city. Washington was very much a Jim Crow city, and part of the requirements of the permission to march was the usual, back of the bus, back of the parade. And Alice Paul, that was not her idea. She reluctantly went along with that. But when Ida Wells from Chicago got off the train at Union Station and joined the Illinois delegation to march, that was fine. That was great. Break the rules. But Alice Paul, like Lucretia Mott, believed in, rights for everybody, universal human equality. That was the Quaker birthright belief. She was descended from William Penn, which is not well known. And she was also the author of the ERA. She named the ERA the Lucretia Mott Amendment. This is in 1913. the parade, and that was, Lucretia was long gone. She died in 1880. So she was not a modern. Alice Paul was a modern. She organized a completely different way, more upfront, in your face. Woodrow Wilson, we're not leaving until you meet our demands. So there's an arc from Lucretia Mott in 1848 to Alice Paul in 1920, and they're linked by the Quaker faith.
And tell me about your, how did Lucretia Mott, come to be your hero? Was it because you went to Swarthmore, or what's the story there?
Jane, if I hadn't gone to Swarthmore, I probably wouldn't even know about her. But it was very much on an intuitive level. When I saw this portrait, I had to meet her. I had to know her. I became associated with her at Swarthmore because I would bring her name up at various protests and events. There are probably 5 or 6 or 7 women who are as obsessed with her as I am. Maybe there'll be 8 or 9 after this. But she just lives with me. She lives with me. I want to.
And what was her role in creating Swarthmore College? Did she have a role in creating it?
Absolutely. She planted one of the first trees on the campus. In 1864, she was 70 or 71. This was her last great act. She and James Mott joined with other Philadelphia Quakers like the Parishes, the Whartons, the Hallowells, the Worths, and they all put and the clothiers of department store fame, they put all their money together and they founded a co-ed establishment, the first co-ed private school on the East Coast. And she and James and all of them, because they were pacifists, in a way their work was done. They couldn't participate in the Civil War. This was the philanthropy that would live on, and it has to this day. It's right outside Philadelphia. You can take the train from 30th Street Station. And I learned later that my mother had been admitted to Swarthmore, and she always regretted that she didn't go. So that's why I got elected to.
You were fulfilling your mother's dream.
Exactly. And I studied history.
I love it. I love it. Well, what initially got Lucretia Mott involved in the fight against slavery?
Well, it really came from the Quaker girlhood. There's an anti-slavery poem called "The Task" by British poet Cooper. She memorized that poem. She learned about the slave trade. It was very personal to her. You know the old saying about the personal is political? That is so true of Lucretia Mott. She took on the burden. She imagined what it was like to be enslaved. And she did everything in her power. She expanded the power of her Quaker, her Quaker womanhood. She made the absolute most of that. And she took her voice and her convictions to the public square when she was in her 30s, in her late 30s. She became known outside the Society of Friends.
And, tell us, here we have this woman, she has 5 children. She's in a relatively affluent community, and she becomes known most for her speeches against abolition and eventually for suffrage. How did all that happen when, in fact, most of the people who were influencing political dialogue were the men of the world. So what made her voice one that people wanted to listen to, even though she was a woman?
Well, getting started in the Society of Friends was an enormous advantage because women are equally empowered to speak in worship. So she never felt like a second-class citizen. And secondly, Jane, she brought this moral authority to her addresses wherever she was, whether it was Nantucket, Philadelphia, Lynn, Massachusetts, a Boston Assembly Hall. She had this sort of command of her message, and she earned the respect, of Frederick Douglass, John Quincy Adams, Ralph Waldo Emerson. These are the great men of the times. She never saw herself as, well, even though I'm a woman, she's like, I am Lucretia Mott, and this is what I have to say, and you will listen.
And tell us about her children. Did any of her children follow in the footsteps?
She was close. She just especially close to her granddaughter Anna. But she had mostly daughters, one son named Thomas, and none of them were in the same league as she was. On a touching personal note, she had a 3-year-old named Tommy. When she was very young, I think she was only 20 or 21. She got married at the age of 18 to James at the Pine Street Meeting House. So Tommy got some kind of terrible illness that couldn't be treated, and he was in bed, basically drawing his last breath, and he looked up to her, and he said, "I love thee, mother." Mm-hmm. And he died. Those are his last words, and she never got over that. One of her granddaughters married Ned Hallowell, and history buffs may know that Ned Hallowell was second in line to Robert Gould Shaw in the 54th Regiment, the African-American regiment that went to battle in South Carolina. And Robert Gould Shaw died in action, and so Ned Hallowell, Quaker, became the commander of that charge. In so doing, he rebelled against the religion. A lot of Quaker young men did so during the Civil War and during World War II. They went to a just war.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, one of our, we're coming close to the end of our time, but one of our listeners has a query. You spoke of the time when John Quincy Adams invited her to speak to the slave owners in Congress, and they had to have the conversation off-site, so to speak. Did any of the slave owners actually come?
Yes, that was the beauty of it. The poetic they came, they listened with respect. This was for an hour or so. It was very, almost like a sermon. And here's this young, not so young, she's 50 years old, but she's still in her prime. She is holding their attention. And that is a very literally moving moment, because the whole idea of moral suasion is to slowly but surely change the world, move the public mind. And from both sides of the aisle, they came to listen to Lucretia Mott.
And do you think is there any documentation that anyone changed their mind or changed their thoughts about this whole thing?
Actually, no, but but what I said is that for that one night, she melted the sectional divide, or she crossed the sectional divide, which was so raging at the time. So it still is a significant moment in American history that very few people know about. And so I'm really delighted that I have a chance to discuss it with you today.
And so if you were to look at the arc of her life and what you've learned about her as you've been, researching to prepare your book, is there a moment that you think was the most impactful, or two moments when you say, here was a time where this was a really defining moment in her work?
The journey to London in 1840, where she became kind of a abolitionist celebrity, I think that gave her even more confidence to speak on a large stage, a public stage. She came home famous, and Seneca Falls was also a turning point. She was the one that everyone listened to, who made the case for women's citizenship, suffrage. Although I might add, it was Douglass who said, put suffrage on the platform. It was his idea, not hers. And so that shows you that how those two really worked in sync. And Seneca Falls was claiming equal rights, citizen suffrage, property ownership. It was saying, look, we are here and we're not going away. And Alice Paul heightened that. I could give another talk about Alice Paul and her brilliant blueprint for protest, but still she was in the paradigm of Quaker nonviolent resistance.
And as we come to our final moments, is there anything that you would like to encourage people to think about as we go through our days of political engagement?
Thank you for that question. I would come back to the importance of voice. And I don't mean on social media. I mean speaking out, being heard, being seen with fellow citizens. She was a great extrovert. She was energized by being out and about, traveling, listening, speaking, making her beautiful sort of her moral appeals to the best in us, appealing to the best in us, not the worst in us. That is what she would do today if Lucretia Mott were still living. And in a way, she still is living.
Great. Well, thank you, Jamie. We're so honored that you took the time to be with us and bring this extraordinary woman to life. I think people will be on the lookout for your book, and we'll certainly, give people a notice in the newsletter about the opportunity when it comes out. We are grateful.
It was wonderful to share some thoughts about Lucretia Mott with you, because I know you're on the same page.
Yes,
you speak out, and she would have loved that you were the mayor of Cleveland. And once you get to know Lucretia Mott, then you always want to know more, to get her to know her better.
I do appreciate that. So we're grateful to all of you who joined us today for this event, for our webinar. Thank you very much, Jamie. As always, it is recorded. we will send you a notice about the recording, and so that you can share it with your friends and neighbors. We remind you, opportunities like this exist because of the support of our friends and neighbors. We call it our NPR moment. Don't forget, make your contributions, keep your cards and letters coming. And we're looking ahead. We've got some upcoming events. And so we invite you to join us next week. We're going to be talking about James A. Garfield and the civil service system. This is something that he was very dedicated to. He served a very short time as president because he was assassinated, but he was really dedicated to making sure that our federal workers were chosen based on qualifications rather than political affiliations, which at his time was quite a controversial activity. So that's coming up next Thursday. And looking ahead to May the 8th, we are going to hear from a constitutional scholar, Erwin Cherminsky, who's been with us when we talked about the series on the More Perfect Union, who has been discussing the faults in the Constitution. So we are going to look at the question, which there's always a question: how long will our democracy last? And Attorney Cherminsky says, no democracy lasts forever. It is a process that you have to continue to claim that democracy. So that should be a very interesting and moderately controversial conversation. So we invite you to come join us for that on May the 8th. Thank you, Jamie.
My pleasure, Jane.
And to all who celebrate Passover, we wish you a good, a joyful Passover, and those who celebrate Easter, a happy Easter. It is a time of family gatherings and family celebrations. Thank you for being with us, and let us pass our history down to our children. Be well. Goodbye.